waking up at 30,000 feet and realizing the cabin around you has gone completely silent. No snoring, no shifting in seats, no crying babies. The engines are still roaring outside your window. The plane is still flying perfectly straight, but every single person around you is completely still. Airplane has completely become a ghost plane, and you are the only one awake to understand what that means. I was on a late-night flight from London to New York. Nothing special about it. Packed cabin, dimmed lights, most people already asleep before we even hit cruising altitude. I had taken a small sleeping pill about an hour into the flight because I had a big day ahead of me when we landed, and I needed rest. I closed my eyes, and that was supposed to be that. But something woke me up. I do not know what it was. No sound, no turbulence, no reason at all. My eyes just opened on their own somewhere over the middle of the Atlantic, and I sat there for a moment staring at the seat in front of me, feeling that something around me was deeply wrong before I even knew why. Then, I looked across the aisle and I saw it. The man sitting next to the window was not moving. Not in the way sleeping people move, where you can see small shifts and breathing movements. He was completely still. Head dropped forward, hands open in his lap, not a single movement anywhere in his body. I looked at the woman ahead of him. Same thing. I slowly turned around and looked behind me down the length of the cabin, and my stomach dropped completely. Every single person I could see was the same way. Heads down, bodies completely still, nobody moving at all. I counted the rows and checked every seat I could see, and there was not one person showing any sign of normal sleep. The flight attendant at the back of the cabin was slumped in her seat with her head resting against the wall. I called out loud enough for the nearby rows to hear me. Not one person moved. I got up and walked to the nearest passenger and shook his shoulder gently. Nothing. I checked his breathing and he was alive. Slow, shallow breaths, but alive. I moved to the next person. Same thing. Alive, but completely unreachable. Like every single person on that plane had been switched off at the same time while I somehow stayed on. That is when I looked up at the overhead air vents above the seats. I held my hand up to the nearest one and felt nothing coming out of it. I moved to another row and checked again. Nothing. The oxygen supply to the cabin had failed. Somewhere over the ocean, the air had slowly been thinning out, and one by one, every person on that flight had quietly lost consciousness without ever feeling it happen. The sleeping pill I had taken had slowed my body down just enough that I had needed less oxygen than everyone else, and that small difference was the only reason I was standing in that aisle instead of slumped in my seat like everyone around me. I went straight to the cockpit door and knocked hard. No answer. I knocked again and pressed my ear against the door and heard nothing but the steady sound of the autopilot keeping the plane on course. The intercom button on the wall did nothing. I was completely alone on a plane at 30,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean with a locked cockpit door and no way to reach anyone on the other side of it. I walked back through the cabin, checking every passenger I could find. All breathing. I sat down on the floor near the front of the cabin and just stayed there because there was absolutely nothing else I could do. The plane kept flying. The autopilot kept the nose perfectly level. Outside the window, the sky was completely black, and the ocean far below was invisible in the darkness. I sat there alone for almost 3 hours before the cockpit door finally opened. The pilots had been on a completely separate oxygen system the whole time and had no idea what had happened behind that door. A valve failure in the main cabin oxygen line had slowly drained the entire supply without setting off a single warning. The autopilot had done its job perfectly. The plane had just kept flying through the dark for 5 hours, carrying a cabin full of unconscious passengers and one very awake and very terrified person sitting on the floor near the front. Every single passenger recovered completely. The official report called it a serious system failure and recommended major changes across the whole fleet. But what no official report can describe is what it actually feels like to sit alone in a silent cabin at 30,000 feet in the middle of the night, surrounded by people you cannot wake up, with a locked door between you and the only people who can save everyone. and nothing to do but wait and hope the plane keeps flying straight. I think about that silence a lot. That complete, heavy, unnatural silence that a cabin full of people should never make. I have never taken a sleeping pill on a flight again.